Legendary for years, you thought you knew the man behind the roar of engines, the laughter, the deals, the chaos. But what if everything you believed about Richard Rawlings was only half the story? And at 55, the truth he's been hiding finally became too heavy to carry. There's a certain kind of silence that only comes after the cameras stop rolling. The kind that doesn't exist in the world of Fast and Loud, where every second feels alive, loud, explosive, almost immortal. But behind that noise, behind the signature grin and fast-talking confidence, there was a different reality forming. One that no audience ever saw. One that even the people closest to him struggled to understand. For decades, Richard built an empire out of speed and risk. He wasn't just flipping cars, he was flipping fate itself, turning rust into gold, chaos into opportunity. Fans saw a man who couldn't be broken. Someone who thrived under pressure, who laughed in the face of failure. But the truth is, there were nights when even he didn't recognize the person staring back at him in the mirror. Close friends began noticing subtle changes. Not the kind that make headlines, but the kind that whisper quietly in the background. Missed calls, late-night isolation. A shift in energy that felt off. The man who once lived for adrenaline started pulling away from the very world he created. And yet, in front of the cameras, nothing changed. Or at least, that's what it looked like. There were rumors, of course. There are always rumors when someone lives as loudly as Richard Rawlings. Some said it was financial pressure. Others whispered about health. A few even claimed it was something far more personal, something tied to regret, to relationships that had quietly fallen apart behind closed doors. But no one had proof, and Richard, he wasn't talking. What made it even more unsettling was how perfectly everything seemed to continue. The deals got bigger, the stakes got higher. The show went on. But those closest to him started to see the cracks forming beneath the surface. A laugh that lingered a second too long. A pause before answering a simple question. Moments where the energy dropped, like a light flickering just before it goes out. People often forget that behind every larger-than-life personality is a human being carrying invisible weight. And for Richard, that weight had been building for years, long before the rumors, long before the whispers. It started in moments no one recorded, conversations no one heard, decisions that seemed small at the time but would later echo louder than any engine he ever rebuilt. There's something else most fans never realized. The pressure of being Richard Rawlings wasn't just external, it was internal. The need to constantly prove, to constantly win, to never slow down. It becomes a prison after a while. And when that kind of pressure has nowhere to go, it starts turning inward. Around the same time, other figures in the automotive entertainment world were facing their own struggles. Jesse James had already gone through public scrutiny and personal collapse. Paul Toodles Sr. had faced family fractures that played out in front of millions. These weren't just stories. They were warnings. And whether Richard admitted it or not, he was watching. Because deep down, he knew something was changing. Not just in his career, but in himself. There were days when filming became harder than he let on. Days when the energy wasn't real, when the excitement had to be forced. And yet, he kept going. Because stopping wasn't an option. Not for someone who had built his identity on never backing down. But what happens when the fight isn't outside anymore? Isn't outside anymore? What happens when the real battle is something you can't film? Something you can't fix with money, or deals, or horsepower? By the time he reached 55, the weight of everything he had avoided, everything he had buried, was no longer something he could outrun. And for the first time in his life, Richard Rawlings found himself facing a truth that didn't come with an easy solution. A truth that would finally push him to break his silence. And when he did, it wasn't what anyone expected. Type. Continue to keep watching. Continue. The strange thing about breaking points is that they rarely arrive in a dramatic explosion. For someone like Richard Rawlings, it wasn't a single moment that shattered everything. It was a slow unraveling. Quiet, persistent, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't paying very close attention. By the time the whispers started gaining traction, those closest to him already knew something was deeply wrong. Not in the way fans might imagine, not some sudden collapse or scandal, but something heavier, something that lingered in his voice, in the way he carried himself when he thought no one was watching. There were long pauses between conversations, nights where sleep didn't come, and mornings where even getting out of bed felt like a negotiation with himself. He had spent so many years building the image of a man who never slows down, that the idea of stopping felt like failure. And for Richard, failure wasn't just uncomfortable, it was terrifying. It meant confronting things he had successfully outrun for decades. Relationships that didn't survive the grind. Moments where success came at a cost he didn't fully understand at the time. There were people who tried to reach him, quietly, carefully. Some from within his inner circle, others from outside, people who had walked similar paths and recognized the signs. One of them, a long twi. Me figure in the world of high-risk, high-reward television, reportedly told him something that stayed with him longer than he admitted. Fame doesn't break you overnight, they said. It just makes it easier to ignore what's already breaking. And that's exactly what had been happening. Even as Fast and Loud continued to echo in the background of his life, the reality behind the scenes was becoming harder to hide. Filming days became emotionally draining. The laughter started feeling rehearsed, and for the first time, there were moments when Richard would step away, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. Some crew members noticed, not openly, not in a way that would ever make headlines, but in small human ways. A look exchanged between takes, a quiet, "You good?" that lingered just a little longer than usual, and sometimes no answer at all. It was around this time that speculation about his health began to surface more aggressively, not because of any official announcement, but because of how unpredictable things had become. There were days when he seemed completely fine, energetic, sharp, in control. And then there were days where something felt off, like he was carrying a weight no one else could see. What made it even more complicated was that Richard himself didn't fully understand what was happening. He wasn't the kind of person who easily admitted vulnerability, not publicly, not even privately. The idea of sitting down and saying, "I'm not okay," it didn't fit the life he had built, But reality has a way of forcing those moments. Behind closed doors, conversations started becoming more serious. Not about business deals or builds, but about him, about whether he needed to slow down, whether something deeper was going on, and for the first time, Richard didn't immediately brush it off. Because deep down, he knew they were right. There were flashes of something he hadn't felt in years. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. A realization that no amount of success could protect him from himself. That all the noise, all the movement, all the chaos, it had been covering something up. Something that was now impossible to ignore. Around the same period, stories from other television figures began resurfacing in conversations around him. Chip Foose had openly spoken about the pressures of maintaining perfection in the spotlight. Mike Brewer had faced intense public scrutiny that took a personal toll. These weren't just industry stories anymore. They were reflections, mirrors that showed Richard a version of himself he wasn't ready to face. And yet the biggest turning point didn't come from fame or pressure or even health rumors. It came from something far more personal. A conversation. One that, according to those closest to him, changed everything. It didn't happen on camera. There were no microphones, no lights, no audience. Just a quiet moment between Richard and someone who knew him not as a TV personality, but as a man. A moment where the walls finally came down, where the performance stopped, and where, for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to be completely honest. What was said in that conversation has never been fully revealed. But what happened after was impossible to ignore. Because not long after that night, Richard Rawlings began to pull back in a way that no one had ever seen before. And the rums. They weren't rumors anymore. They were leading to something real, something he could no longer keep hidden. Type continue to keep watching? Continue. There are moments in a person's life that don't just change direction, they redefine everything that came before. For Richard Rawlings, that moment didn't arrive with cameras or applause. It came quietly, almost painfully, in the aftermath of that private conversation. The one no one fully heard, but everyone eventually felt. In the days that followed, something shifted in him. Not dramatically, not in a way that would immediately alarm fans of Fast and Loud, but enough for those closest to him to realize this wasn't temporary. This wasn't stress. This wasn't burnout. This was something deeper, something that had been waiting for years to surface. He started canceling things, small at first, meetings, appearances. Then bigger commitments began to fall away. For a man who built his entire identity on showing up, on pushing through no matter what, this was unheard of. People didn't know how to react. Some thought it was strategic. Others assumed it was business-related. But behind the scenes, the truth was far more complicated. Because for the first time in his life, Richard wasn't running toward something. He was trying to understand what he had been running from. Those who managed to speak with him during this period described a different kind of energy. Not weaker, not broken, but reflective, slower, as if every word had to pass through something heavy before it could be spoken. There were pauses where there used to be certainty, questions where there used to be answers, and then there were the memories. Not the kind you share on television, not the polished, entertaining stories that fit into an episode. These were different, regrets that didn't fade with time, moments that came back uninvited, late at night when everything else was quiet, decisions that once felt necessary, now feeling irreversible.